What did soldiers do with enemy skulls after battle? In medieval times, a skull was never just a bone left behind on the battlefield. It could become a trophy of victory, a grim warning placed on city walls, or a reminder of mortality kept in churches and chapels. For soldiers and rulers, enemy skulls carried messages of power and fear, shaping how people remembered both the war and its winners. Number 1. Skulls on the battlefield. After a clash, medieval fighters moved through churned earth and broken gear, doing the usual post-battle work-checking who lived, stripping weapons, and identifying the fallen. But skulls often took on a second life as tools of power. Heads were cut off for practical reasons first. To prove a notable enemy was dead, to settle bounties, or to claim favors from a lord. In frontier fighting, a recognizable head could be more convincing than a written note. Commanders also used heads, and later, bare skulls for messaging. In England, the practice of mounting them above gateways became routine state theatre. At London Bridge and at York's Micklegate Bar, preserved, tarred heads stood as long-term warnings that authority could reach anyone. Soldiers understood that display as part of their job, not random cruelty. It was deterrence and bookkeeping rolled together. In sieges, severed heads and other remains were sometimes hurled back by engines, or fixed on palisades to rattle defenders. Grim morale war, rather than mindless shock. Not every skull stayed on show. Churchmen near battlefields gathered bones into charnel houses when crowded graveyards were cleared. The English ossuaries at Hythe and Rothwell are rare survivors of a common medieval solution to limited burial space. Archaeology backs the written record. Skulls from the Wars of the Roses, including Towton, show concentrated sharp force trauma to the head, a pattern that fits close quarters fighting, and helps explain why heads were so often separated and seen as proof. Earlier, English traditions had already normalized beheading as a public penalty, so the leap from execution to military display was small. The same gates that held traitors' heads also received enemies labelled rebels. On the border with Scotland, where feud warfare blurred lines between soldier and raider, collecting and exhibiting heads lingered as evidence of service. To the men who handled them, skulls were not trophies alone. They were receipts, road signs, and stage props in a political show that stretched from the muddy edge of a battlefield to the busiest bridge in the realm. Number 2. Skulls as trophies. After the fighting stopped, trophies helped soldiers turn danger into status, payment, and reputation, and the grimmest trophy was the enemy's head that might later weather into a skull. In frontier wars and private feuds, a recognizable head could prove a kill to a commander or court and unlock reward. Once the flesh was gone, the skull might linger as a personal keepsake in a hall or garrison room, a reminder of risk survived and rank earned. The habit wasn't born in one place. Stories every knight knew, told by clerks, travelers, and returning mercenaries, described steppe and Balkan leaders turning the skulls of defeated rulers into drinking cups, a ritual meant to display victory and absorb prestige. Even if few Europeans ever did it, everyone understood the message. Older traditions in Western Europe also set the frame. Classical writers said Celtic warriors preserved enemy heads with oils, set them over doorways, and kept them in chests, which fed a long memory of the head as a warrior's prize. In the later Middle Ages, English practice channeled that trophy instinct into public theatre. Heads of rebels and enemies of the crown were boiled, tarred, and spiked above gates or bridges. When time stripped them to bone, the skulls still signaled who ruled and who lost. Soldiers who delivered those heads were doing paperwork by other means, turning violence into evidence, and the display multiplied the value of a single kill by frightening many more. Archaeology lines up with the texts. Late medieval battle graves show heavy cranial blows and cut marks that fit quick beheading in the clash or its aftermath, which helps explain why heads were portable proof. In quieter corners, some men kept skulls as private tokens or as memento mori objects beside devotional gear, blending piety with menace. In louder corners, rumors did the work. Tales of skull cups and trophy shelves traveled faster than any patrol, and made opponents picture the worst before swords even crossed. Real skulls mattered, But the fear they stirred was the real currency. Number 3. Skulls in ritual and religion. After battles, many skulls did not remain with soldiers, but were taken into the hands of the church. In overcrowded cemeteries, they were stacked in charnel houses and crypts, where rows of skulls reminded people of death and the limits of earthly life. At Hythe and Rothwell, you can still see these collections today, built from the belief in purgatory and the need to pray for the souls of the dead. Soldiers often encountered such places, and to men used to loss, the ordered display of bones made a harsh kind of sense. At the same time, churches created reliquaries shaped like heads, placing the skulls of saints inside them. These reliquaries were carried in processions or set on altars, and a soldier who once saw an enemy skull on the battlefield could later see a jeweled saint's skull in a nave and understand it in a very different way. In Central Europe, ossuaries such as Sedlec arranged skulls in patterns, turning bones into visual sermons about the Last Judgment. Across Europe, the Dance Macabre and other memento mori images reminded people to think about death, a message that reached garrisons as much as townsfolk. Some knights even kept skulls beside prayer books as private reminders of mortality. Accusations against the Templars show how powerful head imagery had become when politics and piety mixed. It was not that soldiers worshipped skulls, but the skull as relic or reminder carried emotional weight. In a world of processions, chantries, and mass graves, skulls shifted from battlefield remains into religious signs that organized memory, discipline, and hope throughout the later Middle Ages. Number 4. Skulls as warnings. In medieval times, skulls often served a purpose far beyond the battlefield. Authorities used them as public warnings, transforming human remains into unmistakable symbols of power. After executions or battles, heads were set on spikes above bridges, gates, and castle walls. Over time, as the flesh decayed, skulls remained, continuing to send the same chilling message. In London, the southern gate of Old London Bridge became one of the most famous places for such displays. Travellers and merchants crossing the Thames could not avoid the sight of rows of heads, preserved in tar to last longer, staring down at them. This practice was carefully organized by officials whose role was to prepare and replace the exhibits, showing that it was not a random act of cruelty, but a calculated form of political theatre. York followed a similar tradition at Micklegate Bar, the city's main southern gate. When the king entered York, he passed under the very place where rebels' heads were fixed, making the triumph of royal authority visible to everyone. It tied ceremony and punishment together in one display. The practice lasted for centuries, because it worked. Skulls on gates reminded townspeople and visitors of the risks of treason and rebellion more effectively than written laws could. They turned justice into something you could not only hear about, but see every day. During sieges, skulls also played a role in psychological warfare. Victorious armies mounted them on palisades or hurled them over city walls with siege engines. The goal was not infection, as later myths sometimes suggest, but fear. Defenders looking down from the ramparts saw the faces of their fallen comrades thrown back at them. This grim sight often shook morale and forced quicker negotiations. Soldiers treated it as part of strategy rather than random brutality. The Tower of London added another layer to this culture. Prisoners were brought in by water, executions were carried out nearby, and their heads often joined the display on London Bridge. Over time, as the city grew, Temple Bar took over as a new location for these grisly warnings. Yet the meaning did not change. Skulls acted as signs on the frontier, in towns, and at royal strongholds, each one saying that power had the last word. In an age where sight and ritual mattered deeply, a skull was more than bone. It was a message fixed in public space, forcing everyone who passed beneath it to remember who ruled and what happened to those who defied that rule. Number 5. Skulls in memory and legend. When wars ended, skulls of the defeated did not always disappear quietly. They often stayed in public memory, shaping how communities thought about power, justice, and violence. One of the clearest examples is York, where the southern gate known as Micklegate Bar displayed the heads of executed rebels. Citizens walking through the gate each day were reminded of those who had opposed the crown. Chroniclers recorded the names of men whose skulls hung there, and even after the last display was removed in the 18th century, the gate itself carried the story of past warnings. London had a similar tradition. Old London Bridge became famous for the row of heads that greeted anyone entering the city. Officials treated this as an organized practice. Heads were boiled, tarred, and mounted on spikes to slow decay. Diarists such as Samuel Pepys wrote about the grisly sight. Later, the practice moved to Temple Bar, but the meaning remained the same. The skulls were public reminders of the danger of treason. Over time, these displays became part of the city's history, remembered in chronicles, travelers' accounts, and even plays. The theatre world mirrored this memory. Elizabethan dramas often used severed heads as stage props. Audiences understood the symbolism because they had seen the real thing on city gates. Stage plays reinforced the association between skulls and justice, ensuring the image stayed alive long after the practice itself faded. Memory passed from real bones in public spaces to fictional heads in stories and performances. Religion also shaped how skulls were remembered. Churches and monasteries kept skulls in charnel houses and ossuaries when graveyards became too full. At Hythe and Rothwell, rows of skulls can still be seen today. These were not political warnings, but reminders of mortality, teaching visitors that death came to all people regardless of status. At the same time, reliquaries shaped like heads preserved the skulls of saints. These sacred objects gave skulls a positive meaning, turning them into symbols of holiness and protection. For soldiers who once saw enemy skulls on the battlefield, seeing jeweled skulls on an altar connected warfare, faith and memory in surprising ways. Folklore gave skulls another role. In rural areas, legends developed about screaming skulls that cursed households if removed. People believed storms, illness, or misfortune would follow if a skull was taken away from its resting place. These stories kept the association of skulls with danger and warning alive, even for people who had never witnessed war. The skull became a supernatural reminder, rooted in cultural memory rather than actual conflict. Old tales of skull cups and ancestral heads also survived as heritage stories. Chroniclers repeated them to describe the customs of past peoples, from steppe warriors to Celtic tribes. These accounts helped later generations imagine how victory had once been shown and how authority had been reinforced. In the end, soldiers did not need to keep skulls in their homes for them to remain powerful. City gates, church crypts, theater stages, and rural legends all carried the memory forward. Skulls became cultural signs, remembered as symbols of punishment, devotion, and fear. They turned into one of the lasting images of medieval warfare, fixed in the minds of people long after the battles were over.